Everybody needs good neighbors, just a friendly wave each morning helps to make a better day. Neighbors need to get to know each other. Next door is only a footstep away. Neighbors, everybody needs good neighbors with a little understanding. You can find the perfect blend. Neighbors should be there for one another. That's when good neighbors become friends.
Monday night on 1, and not only Peter Cook but also Dudley Moore join Wogan. Then at 7:30, Watchdog puts the MOT system to the test and discovers if the certificate is worth the paper it's written on. At 8 o'clock, it's the quarterfinals, and Noel's getting tough.
She's very young.
Yes, and stupid.
Then at 8:30, keeping up appearances.
Daisy, how are you, dear? Daddy ill? How ill? Is it of a severity necessary to cancel my candlelight supper?
After the news at 9:30, Panorama reports on the government's new plans to tackle the crisis in the family and make absent fathers pay for their children. Then at 10:10,
Either one of you two hot shots ever been undercover?
It has nothing to do with this.
Well, I have. If something goes wrong, your case agent gets you out. He's your lifeline. I put Danny into this, I'm gonna get him out.
and with rock and roll, education and advice, that's Monday night on 1.
Earlier, in Look North, the woman who says her hostage son has been put at risk by Mrs. Thatcher. The woman with 2 new children adopted from Romania. And Invasion of the Body Snatchers, why lobsters face an alarming new predator. Look North is at 6:30 on 1.
This is BBC1.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Peter Sissons and Moira Stewart.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. The United Nations Security Council are meeting now to vote on tougher international measures against Iraq. They plan to hold Iraq liable for war damages and abuses of human rights. In hiding in Kuwait, a Westerner describes atrocities by Iraqi troops. Maintenance for Children. A new agency will track down fathers who don't pay. And registering Britain's 7.5 million dogs. The Commons vote tonight. The government face defeat. The Security Council of the United Nations is due to vote any time now on a resolution that will hold Iraq financially accountable for war damages and economic losses caused by its invasion of Kuwait. The resolution, for which there's expected to be overwhelming support, invites countries, businesses and individuals to add up their losses and submit them as evidence to the Security Council. Kuwait's ambassador to the UN has spoken already of a claim worth billions of dollars, but the UN resolution does not say how ultimately claims will be made against Baghdad. It also invites member nations to collect information on abuses of human rights by Iraq, which is seen as a move towards establishing Iraq's responsibility for war crimes. It's the 10th United Nations resolution since the Iraqi invasion, and it demands also that Iraq should immediately restore water and electricity services to foreign embassies in Kuwait and allow them food deliveries.
The Security Council should have voted on this resolution 2 days ago, but the Soviet Union asked for a postponement while Yevgeny Primakov tried more peace talks in Baghdad. Those appear to have failed, and today the Iraqi ambassador here said that America is sabotaging negotiations. The Security Council resolution demands that the Iraqi army end their siege of foreign embassies in Kuwait, and it calls for evidence to be collected about the destruction of property and human rights there. That will pave the way for making Iraq pay financial compensation and for putting its leaders on trial for war crimes. The Americans are especially pleased with this resolution. They feared the UN had lost the early momentum of its campaign against Iraqi aggression. Recently, the United Nations has been preoccupied with the issue of Israel, and this is the first Security Council resolution against Iraq for more than a month. But it keeps up the pressure on Saddam Hussein, and it threatens him with further unspecified measures if he fails to pull out of Kuwait. And in an uncompromising speech in Hawaii, President Bush has promised to hold the Iraqi leader accountable.
Today, in the Persian Gulf, what we are looking at is good and evil, right and wrong.
And he said no concessions can be given to Iraq.
Appeasement leads only to further aggression and ultimately to war. And we are not going to make the mistake of appeasement again.
He was speaking close to Pearl Harbor, and he said America has learned the lessons of the Second World War. Ben Brown, BBC News, New York.
In the first videotape interviews to have come to us from occupied Kuwait City, an American and an Australian have been describing life in hiding there. The interviews were given at the end of last month and smuggled out of the country 3 days later. In them, the men talk about the conditions and the atrocities going on, and they make a strong plea for military action now.
Hidden in the buildings of occupied Kuwait, surviving despite the searches of the Iraqi army, are an estimated 1,300 Westerners. A few have been reached by telephone, but now, for the first time, 2 have recorded a message on video, and copies of their tape have been smuggled to London.
We are in deep hiding and have not moved out in over 50 days. During the first few days of the invasion, we moved about, but this proved terribly dangerous. I and one other were arrested, were being shipped to Baghdad, but through guile managed our escape. Our attempts to cross the desert in a two-wheel drive proved futile. Our days are filled with both hope and despair. We dread the knock on the door that may take us away to unknown sights, to long imprisonment and to possible death.
According to the testimony of this American and of his Australian companion, the Iraqis are running Kuwait by terror, suppressing Kuwaiti identity and crushing Kuwaiti resistance.
They go into an area, they would take out families, they would shoot the eldest son in front of his mother and his father. They would burn the house, take the family away, beat them up, and just bring them back and dump them on the streets. They did this in some areas, and they went to the next area and said, if all the guns are not out on the street by 6 in the morning, we're coming in. Sure enough, by the morning, a lot of the guns were out on the street.
Even so, he says, the Kuwaitis will rise up if the Allies attack Iraq, even though the atrocities continue.
3 Kuwaiti children were wearing the Kuwaiti flag on their robes. A soldier came in and just shot them in front of their mother. Little children. These are kids who should be in year 8 in high school. The Iraqis came around with posters of their fearless leader Saddam Hussein, telling the manager of the cooperative to put him up on the wall. He refused. They shot him. This goes on and on and on.
As to the existence of the Westerners under these conditions, they estimate that their food stocks will last until Christmas, but the American has a lower estimate of his government's interest in him.
We know we are of the lowest priority. The President himself listed us so. Yet we do not accept this should be so. Our greatest fear is that you will forget us, and that we will be forced to starve or surrender.
The answer, according to the Australian, is war.
I don't support war for the sake of war. We've seen enough death and destruction here. We don't want to see any more. But that is why we would support an attack, because we feel that this is the minimum, this is the path which would result in the minimum suffering in the long term. We don't want to see anyone die, to see any more fighting. We've had enough. We've seen it below our bedroom windows, our living room windows.
He knows of the Allied build-up in Saudi Arabia from reports on the BBC World Service and asks, Mr. Bush, what are you waiting for? It's a view that, if representative, may make the decision to go to war slightly easier.
Nearly 300 French hostages being held in Iraq are reported to have left for Paris. An Iraqi Airways Boeing 747 carrying them is said to have taken off from Baghdad in the past hour. Meanwhile, despite the apparent failure of the latest Soviet mission to Baghdad, President Saddam Hussein says the talks with the Soviet envoy, Yevgeny Primakov, were very useful. From Baghdad, John Simpson.
Mr. Primakov's usual bounce seemed to have deserted him when he left here today. According to his boss, Mr. Gorbachev, his soundings here had indicated some change in the Iraqi position, but it wasn't as great as he'd wanted. Someone asked him if he was disappointed.
Yes.
Ahead of him lay the task of trying to encourage an inter-Arab conference to resolve the crisis peacefully. Western diplomats are dubious about that. But the Iraqi government is still banking on its belief that the Americans won't attack. And the foreign minister, in his first interview with British television, expected the diplomatic process to continue.
I'm not disappointed. Mr. Primakov has started a mission early this month. Now he's leaving to another capital. So he's continuing his mission, to my knowledge.
Are you still optimistic for the future, as you said the other night when he arrived?
Yes, I am. I've always been optimistic. Matters of diplomacy and such complicated issues need patience and continuation.
So you don't see this as the end of the line for diplomacy?
No, it is not.
That's the Soviet position too, but the failure of Mr. Primakov's mission here makes it harder to sustain. In an American television interview today, President Saddam Hussein himself was also thinking in terms of negotiation.
I haven't seen any statement in which Primakov has said that the visit that he's made to Iraq is the last chance for anything. But I have seen statements issued by the president of the Soviet Union in which he stresses the necessity of search for means other than the military means for or confrontation for the solution of this crisis.
For ordinary Iraqis who've reluctantly been getting used to petrol rationing over the past week, there was an unexpected government U-turn last night. The minister who introduced the rationing was sacked. Last week, the country was told there weren't enough additives for the petrol refineries. Suddenly, it seems there are. Rationing was deeply unpopular, and this pump attendant was attacked by angry drivers.
To try to kill me, like my skin is blue, but they...
Now Iraq's self-confidence is back as strong as ever.
There's petrol, there's no petrol, we can use, we can live.
You don't think the Iraqi government's in trouble?
In trouble? No, I think the Americans are in trouble now.
As for the foreign prisoners here, there are 300 or so fewer of them tonight. The entire French hostage community was allowed to leave today. Many of those who remain are accusing France of doing a secret deal. But it's more likely that Iraq has done this to win French support for a diplomatic, not a military outcome to the crisis. So far, it's working. John Simpson, BBC News, Baghdad.
President Gorbachev says the best chance for a peaceful solution to the Gulf crisis lies with the Arab world. Speaking in France after talks with President Mitterrand, he called for an inter-Arab summit on the crisis, and he said that a military solution was unacceptable. From Paris, David Walter.
When President Mitterrand brought President Gorbachev to the Chateau of Rambouillet outside Paris this morning, there was speculation that the two leaders might discuss breaking ranks with their Security Council allies on the Gulf. Both countries had close ties with Iraq before the invasion of Kuwait. Both are strongly in favor of an international conference on the Middle East if Saddam signals his willingness to withdraw. In the event, the two leaders were anxious not only to prove how close they were to each other, they signed a treaty of friendship, but also to show complete solidarity with their allies in the Security Council. With his host's strong approval, Mr. Gorbachev had a clear message for Saddam Hussein, that it was useless to try and split the international community in its firm opposition towards the invasion of Kuwait. But at the press conference, the Soviet leader did suggest that his envoy, Mr. Primakov, hadn't come away from his talks with Saddam Hussein at the weekend completely empty-handed.
The Primakov meeting showed that President Hussein's position
is no longer the same as it was a while ago. It seems to me that new ideas have emerged.
Mr. Gorbachev left Paris without spelling out exactly how he thought Saddam Hussein's position had altered. But he did say he thought there could be progress if there was more dialogue between the Iraqis and other Arab countries. David Walter, BBC News, Paris.
The Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir David Craig, says Saddam Hussein shows no sign of withdrawing from Kuwait and is continuing to commit atrocities. Sir David was speaking in Saudi Arabia as he visited troops from the 7th Armoured Brigade who've been continuing their training in the desert. From Saudi Arabia, Martin Bell.
On a road into the desert today, this convoy was an indication of what the British could be getting into. A medical deployment 1,300 strong, a field ambulance and field hospital able to take care of 500 battle casualties. Among the Royal Engineers, numbers have gone up from 300 in the first plan to 1,000 now, for everything from road building to mine clearance to water supply. And a spirit of improvisation is already at work. Everything here is British, except the helicopters and, to some extent, the command. The Chief of the General Staff, on a visit to British troops today, said he was satisfied with the command structure, even though the British would presumably have more say in the making than execution of a battle plan. Allied commanders don't believe that Saddam is suing for peace.
He's been a very vicious aggressor. He continues to commit atrocities in Kuwait. He doesn't show any signs of letting up in that way.
And the American Marines with whom the British will be working are rehearsing offensive actions, from finding their way through minefields to nighttime helicopter raids behind enemy lines. The Marines have the air power, the manpower, and a certain way of dealing with their enemy, even when he's just a fellow Marine playing the part of an Iraqi. What they lack is the heavy armor. That's where the British come in and can be expected to be in the forefront of any push to the north. Martin Bell, BBC News, in the Saudi desert.
Mrs Thatcher is to make a statement to the Commons tomorrow on the outcome of the weekend European summit in Rome. 11 out of the 12 community countries, with Britain dissenting, agreed a timetable towards currency union. The speed of events in Rome has reopened divisions within the Conservative Party at Westminster. Our chief political correspondent, John Sargent, reports.
The Conservative Party chairman, Kenneth Baker, arrived for a regular meeting at number 10, well aware of how the Rome summit had opened up Tory divisions on Europe. Mrs Thatcher's performance at the summit has been privately criticised by some Tory MPs. They didn't like the frank criticism she made of the way the summit had been organised, nor did they like Mrs Thatcher's comment that her European partners were living in cloud cuckoo land on the subject of a single currency. Officials from the European Commission were also concerned about the danger that Britain could be left out in the next moves towards economic integration in Europe.
To join at a later stage, you don't get the benefits that you do for quite a while until you join, and you also get less say in the way it's run, and that seems to be a lesson that still needs to be learned.
At Westminster, much of the reaction split on predictable lines, with those who share the Prime Minister's reservations on Europe arguing that she stood up for British interests.
She's signalling that she does not think, nor do I, that the House of Commons, or indeed British people as a whole, would consent to moves which would amount to removing the powers of Parliament to have any real influence on economic policy in this country.
But one of the leading Tories in favour of much closer ties with Europe believes that Mrs Thatcher's remarks shouldn't be taken at face value.
All national politicians have to appeal to a domestic audience, but what is rather more important than what